So welcome back, and this next lesson, which is all about the midlife transition, the midlife phase. So this idea of the midlife phase is a key part really of the discussion on shadow work. These two ideas are very much related. Midlife is generally the time when the shadow becomes a real issue. Now, it's not that the shadow is only present in midlife or that it doesn't create conflict until midlife. As I mentioned in the last lesson, the very fact that we identify one way and not another way is always creating a kind of conflict. It's creating a conflict from the moment it happens, from that very, very early stages in life, and throughout our teenage years and throughout young adulthood. But it's really only at a certain time that the shadow starts to really not only present a challenge, a conflict, but that addressing the shadow becomes the next thing we must do. That beginning shadow work becomes the key step in our onward journey towards self-knowledge. If you remember, our whole pursuit is that of self-knowledge. Even if it appears as though we're learning how to do our job, we're learning a language, we're taking tennis lessons, whatever it is, even though it appears that we're pursuing maybe a very specific skill, underneath it all, what there really is the pursuit of self-knowledge. And so for that process to continue, at some point, shadow work will be demanded of us. And that tends to be around midlife. So when is midlife? Well, there is no fixed time. There are actually meaningful inputs we can take from, well, certainly astrology here, actually. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. So there is kind of like a line in the sand. There is actually an astrological midlife. But there's also perhaps a moment or a series of moments that can happen. You hear about it happening when, say, people reach a kind of platitude in their professional, material, and personal endeavors. They've reached a certain point of success in their livelihood. They've maybe settled down, had children, had a couple of kids. Certainly not a necessary feature of midlife at all, but it's often associated with this kind of like, well, what now? Not only that, but this isn't how I imagined it. The reality isn't fitting the image. What's that about? And so I'm pursuing this career and I'm embarking in some kind of maybe a sales job, or I'm working as a doctor, and okay, I'm making money, but even though I associated money at one point, the image of money or the symbol of contribution with genuine contentment and fulfillment, I realize that that's not happening. And why is that? Because it's not the real thing. It's merely a snapshot of it. So it cannot on its own satisfy the real thing. And so by maximizing it for its own sake, by maximizing professional development, the appearance of success, meeting specification and expectation, and making number go up, well, the more I double down on that, the more the image of it is going to deviate from the real thing. The more and more and more preposterous it's going to seem, and the more direct experience of suffering I'm going to have. So at some point it becomes like a little suspicion, oh, this isn't quite working out the way I thought. There becomes tension, there maybe becomes arguments and disagreements if we're not fully mindful of what's going on here. But at some point along the line, it's like an elastic band, it's just going to create this great snap, and something has to shift. Be like holding up a chicken and pretending it's a duck, and that's just, no one's fooled by that. But there's also encounters with our own mortality that occur. There may be direct sort of experiences of danger, risk, near-death experiences that make us go, whoa, I'm completely mortal. Maybe injuries, maybe chronic injuries, maybe acute trauma. So there is this immediate experience that can put us face to face with our own mortality. And as we saw in an earlier lesson in the dialectic here, when life meets mortality, the way to negate that is through authentic living. And so we're then called to start living according to our personal essence, our personal template, towards our preferences and towards our individuated selves. And so then that shows up this negation in the form of the shadow. There is this way that I don't want to be, but there's also this way that I do want to be. And what's that about? Because there's part of the shadow we do want to be, and there's part of the shadow we don't want to be. And at this point in time, we're just seeing them both as shadow. We're seeing them both as just, oh, well, I don't want that. But actually, well, they are both shadow, but they both might be linked to the same general image. If we show up as the caregiver, we don't want to be the warrior. But in truth, the essence is that, well, the warrior contains something very, very useful. The ability to systemize, the ability to be efficient, the ability to get things done, which, hey, let's be honest, at this point in our lives, we probably need. But then at the same time, it contains a lot of darkness as well, which we have disidentified from. And we end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We don't want to be the dark side, so we throw out the good side with it. So this whole experience forces us, this mortality forces us to face all of that. And also simply the time that's elapsed in our lives. Because when you're very young, it's hard to get a meaningful grasp on how long your life actually is. But as you start getting into your 30s, certainly mid-30s, 40s, by then it's like, oh, well, I actually have some tangible sense of the duration of my life at this point in time. Wow, higher self comes calling at that point. So hence we have what Jung referred to as the afternoon of life. He said, we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. What was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true, at evening will have become a lie. How about that? How can something that's true become a lie? How is that even possible? Because everything is a contradiction, because everything in our world is based in duality. So everything contains some truth and everything contains some falsity. Even a statement that is a blatant lie kind of contains some truth. Because if I say that 1 + 1 is 3, well, obviously that's not true. But is it? Because if I say that, I'm not literally saying that 1 + 1 is 3. I'm pointing to something else. I'm pointing to a kind of truth. In this case, the truth of contradiction. So if someone comes up to you and says, are you saved? I am Jesus. Well, they're not Jesus, right? Of course, not in a literal sense. Are they even Jesus in a metaphorical sense? Maybe they are. But what they're really saying is, I need help. I'm not seeing things clearly. There's something I don't understand. So in order to understand the truth, we might have to cease taking things literally. We may have to understand the true meaning of what they're saying, the symbolism of what they're saying, no doubt. So in that way, there is some truth in everything, because as Jacob Bohm said, what the self describes the self. So if I go around asking people if they're saved and claiming to be Jesus, I'm describing my own insanity. So there's complete truth in what I'm saying. And at the same time, there's also falsity. Hopefully this is making sense. So it's entirely possible that what was true in the morning of life, the way I was showing up, the way I postulated myself in the world, there's a kind of truth to that. There is, of course, some truth in that. But it becomes a lie. It becomes, this is not who I am, really. This is merely a snapshot of me. This is merely a snapshot of me when I was 25 years old. What else is me? What else is part of this? So we cannot live the afternoon to that very same program. The natural process, this must change, this must unfold this way. And we can deny it. Of course we can. We have free will to do just that. This is why it's a considerable moral effort, because the ego and its will, its free will, must be involved. It must involve morality. If it was prescribed, if it was predetermined, how would that be selfhood? Because then by nature, the thing that's at the heart of it, that's inherently uncontradictory, that is freedom, must itself be defined in some deterministic sense. So that can't happen. So there has to be freedom involved and a conscious moral effort. So this midlife phase has certain markers. It involves a reevaluation of life choices. Naturally, of course it does, because we have to bring on board more of our essence. The emergence of the unlived life, encounters with not only the shadow, but also the anima and the animus. This is further unconscious aspects of ourselves, the archetypal feminine, the anima, and the archetypal masculine, the animus, which of course show up in our experience as the opposite sex. So not only are they archetypal, but they show up in the stereotype of man and woman. But also these have collective elements as well. So they belong to the objective psyche beyond our own personal experience and our own personal unconscious. So it's a very, very deep and important archetype. But it also involves showing up with our anima and animus, or encountering it as well. So men typically have to engage with their inner feminine and make that conscious. Women have to do the same with their masculine. If they are very feminine women, which not all women are, of course, So you can be a feminine man and a masculine woman, and it works in just the same way. It doesn't mean becoming more feminine if you are a masculine man, but it does mean coming to understand the feminine. It does mean coming to respect the feminine. It does mean coming to integrate an aspect of the feminine. But moreover, it also means deepening and cultivating a relationship with the feminine. So there's this beautiful thing that occurs where you see it as separate, but also part of you at the same time. And you engage with it as the ego, but also as connecting with part of you that exists, but also as appearing out there in the world as well, recognizing its inherent sort of unconsciousness and mystery. And it's by deepening a relationship with it and changing our attitude to it that we also invite the opposite, whether it's masculine or feminine, to respond to us in a healthier way as well, in a way that's non-compensatory in a moral sense. Encounters with mortality and morality, that's actually kind of important, actually. Maybe we should add that to this slide. Spiritual and psychological inquiry. So not only are we going through this process, but we're also coming to understand the process itself. It's like this meta understanding of what's really going on. And this is vital because no longer are we just only pursuing worldly skills and abilities, but in doing so, understanding the profundity of those constituent pursuits. That these are all a way of coming back to self-knowledge itself. So naturally, this means a breakdown of old methods and models, but in a very significant way. This is not simply, I used to struggle with coming to Georgia and understanding that the culture in some ways seemed impolite to me. Like, that's quite a superficial appearance of something that's much, much deeper. And so it's the very breakdown, say, think in terms of the spiral dynamics we looked at, the very breakdown of the belief that achievement is the way forward, or that humanitarianism is the way forward, or that authoritarianism or religion is the way forward, like an exoteric, absolutist form of religion. It's the very breakdown of all of that, moving towards a much more holistic, dynamic understanding of an unfolding. So entire paradigms break down within the microcosm of one's own life. And so this can all happen at any stage of life. Yeah, you can get involved in spiritual inquiry at any stage of life. Yes, you can have an encounter with mortality even in your early 20s, and it doesn't necessarily imply midlife. It doesn't even necessarily entail shadow work. But these are indicators, let's say. They're not hard and fast demonstrations of, but they are often correlated or associated with. So these are also catalysts. So these are the kinds of things that can actually happen to bring about this midlife phase. And one of which is simply time. And by that, I don't mean ontic time or worldly time that we define ourselves. This is a human invention. It's not about days, years, hours, and months. It's about the actual unfolding of cause and effect in our lives. It's that certain things actually happen and unfold in our lives. And what is that other than the interaction of opposites within our experience? And so as more and more opposites within ourselves meet and reconcile in our minds, in our awareness, eventually at some point we end up facing the shadow itself. So it's really just the result of things having happened and being experienced in mind. The breakdown of old methods and models, quite simply, right? I mean, this was also on the previous slide as one of the markers, but it's also a catalyst. So methods of achievement, methods of producing an income, approaching work. Have you noticed that the working world is very, very different from how it was even 10 years ago? The process of finding work is very different from how it was. No longer can you just guarantee, there was never a guarantee, but the idea of buying a house and just sitting on it and taking out a huge leverage loan with which to buy assets and sitting on it for 40 years, that's not guaranteed anymore. I mean, where else would you hear someone encouraging you to take out a leverage loan and buy something with it? Only traders who really know what they're doing would advise that, probably. So methods of moving forward cease to produce results in the same way, or the results that they do produce do not gratify the essence that they purported to represent, and therefore models. This can absolutely happen in a spiritual sense, in terms of our belief systems. We might move forward with a certain model of existence, a certain way of categorizing or making sense of what we go through, And that may have acted as a crutch for some time. Like a certain spiritual tradition may have brought us great relief and groundedness. And as slowly over time cracks start to appear, because it's relatively fixed, there's always examples that don't fit the model. And so eventually the model breaks down. And as this happens time and time again, eventually we start to realize more holistically that no model can be correct. And why is that? Well, that leads to a great inquiry into the very nature of our experience and of mind. So then we're talking about all the stuff we've been talking about, idealism, the philosophy, the unconscious mind, the role that plays. So we're trying to reach this higher level model, if you like, but at the same time, understanding that there is no model. There is no model that is absolutely true. There cannot be. So of course, significant life shifts, whether it's losing a job, whether it's a breakup, whether it's a health problem, as we've discussed, and of course, encounters with mortality being part of that. So at its core, this is encounters with psychological realities, with tension, with opposites, and their need for reconciliation. And nothing can reconcile on its own. The only place anything can ever reconcile is in the mind. It's in conscious awareness. Of course, it happens in the world, but it happens in the world whilst we're aware of it. It has a corollary in the world, and not least we can resolve our minds through what we do in the world. It's crucial, but it's really about coming to terms with the essence. The essence contains a certain truth, and every time we postulate something that doesn't contain aspects of that truth, it's necessary that we will eventually encounter some kind of negation, some kind of antithesis that must be taken on board. And within that antithesis, there is both truth and falsity, and that is the process of sublation, is finding what is true within it, discarding what isn't. So, well, there's actually an astrological take on this concept of midlife as well, and this is very interesting. If you bear in mind that the Earth itself has what is known as the precession. You may well be familiar with this already, but the precession is due to the wobble of the Earth. So the Earth is not only rotating and not only orbiting, but it's also sort of wobbling on its axis. And what this means is that over a longer period of time, the position of the stars relative to the sun and relative to the time of year move very, very slowly. So this has implications for astrology, because what this means is that the stars of Aries are no longer in the house of Aries. This means that the stars of Aries, which used to appear in spring, April, now they don't actually. So even though we call Aries, the beginning of Aries, approximately the 21st of April, the actual constellation of Aries has now actually moved on. In fact, it's actually moved on by approximately 23 degrees. So almost an entire sign, like 3/4 of an entire sign has moved. So we still use the houses, not the stars, in Western astrology. There are other kinds. There's sidereal astrology, which uses the stars themselves. But here's the thing. It takes approximately a typical human lifetime for the precession to move by 1 degree. This is also why there are 360, roughly, days in a year. A day is the amount of time it takes the sun to move 1 degree relatively to us. And so a typical human lifetime, I mean, people are living longer than this now, but there's an esoteric significance in this. And so it takes 71.59 years for the Earth's precession to move by 1 degree. So a day is a kind of an arc of existence, a unit of time. There is this great thesis, antithesis, synthesis that unfolds over the course of a single day. And then we return back to unconsciousness at night. There's also an arc that exists over the course of a human lifetime. And that's why we have birth, coming into ourselves, postulating ourselves, and then midlife, right? And then shadow work, and then a return to wholeness. But it's a return to wholeness in a more conscious state with greater self-knowledge. So what this means is that there is such a thing as astrological midlife. And interestingly, there are 36 decans in a cycle of, well, in a year. Each one is 10 degrees, each one lasting approximately 10 days. So here you can see it on this diagram here. For example, the sign of Aries is 1/12 of the zodiac, just like all the other signs, assuming equal size signs. And so the sign of Aries consists of 30 degrees of sky, or approximately 30 days, or 3 decans, each of 10 degrees. And so within the sign of Aries, you also have 3 decans. You have the first, the second, and the third. I just thought that was interesting that there are 36 decans in a cycle, and the astrological midlife is also around the 36th birthday. It's actually slightly before. So if you think 71.59 years, divide that by 2, that's 35.7 something. So it's actually like a couple of months before the 36th birthday. But approximately speaking, that's astrological midlife. So even though the previous catalysts and signs that we talked about are certainly how this is showing up, there's a kind of astrological significance to this too. And so in tarot readings, this has a bearing because certain cards refer to the astrological second half of life, and certain cards refer to the astrological first half of life. But midlife and the movement into the second half of life is fundamentally a psychological shift, first and foremost. But I just want to give you this other angle to it here, and that the very notion of midlife is kind of implicit in the movement of the heavenly bodies, the sun and the stars. And also this link between there being 36 decans in a cycle and midlife occurring at the 36th birthday. This also seems like a little hint. Our world leaves us these little hints, these little synchronicities, much like the fact that the sun and the moon appear at the same size in the sky, and that the female menstrual cycle is approximate to the length of the lunar cycle and this kind of thing, the moon being a sign of the feminine. So there's all these little clues which by themselves don't prove anything, because if they did, then, well, that wouldn't be much of a moral choice, would it, towards freedom? But that's also precisely the point. They cannot prove anything because the movement is towards self-knowledge, not towards a determined materialist permanent structure of some kind, but towards self-knowledge, not away from it. So therefore, as I was just saying, midlife marks a choice. We have a free choice as to whether to confront, to negate the negation, to meet with what's showing up, or to push it away. We can do that. There's all manner of ways, of tools we can resist. There's a smorgasbord of coping mechanisms right there available to us. And if we decide to do that, hey, the industries of the world are right there waiting to help us, right? The pharmaceutical industry will happily load us with drugs to push this away. But if we wish to make the choice, well, it's in some sense a harder road. There's energy involved, there's feeling involved. There is what Freud referred to as ordinary or legitimate human suffering, but it's a movement away from neurotic suffering and towards authenticity. So the choice, therefore, is towards authenticity, meeting our personal psychic template, versus conformity, adhering to merely the expectations of the world. It's not to say that other people's desires or ideas or expectations don't have some value, because of course everything in existence has some value. It is within that very much contains elements of the essence. It is in that antithesis that contains what we need. But bear in mind that by and large, pervadingly, the expectations of society are not for us to realize our authentic selves. How could it be? That's why conformity is inherently a problematic thing. It's antithetical to self-knowledge. So it's a choice between truth, realizing the essence, ebbing and flowing towards that despite the challenge, versus illusion, falling in love with mere imagery at the expense of the real thing. And not only that, but at some point having to preposterously choose that because truth is too painful, because we cannot cope with, perhaps because we haven't trained ourselves, because we haven't been setting our intention and moving gradually towards doing the work, that the mere thought of it is just unpalatable. So we lunge for things that make it go away in the near term. Well, there's only one inevitable destination from that, and that is falsity, that is illusion. So I've got here realness versus images. Now, the imagination is a wonderful thing. We're always dealing with images. There's nothing wrong with images. But there is a problem with low resolution, coarse caricatures, like cartoons of the real thing, at the expense of understanding the essence in itself. Now, we're always dealing with images. We're always using them as a way to understand what is real. But It's about moving ever closer to the realness. And now, so finally here, internally generated well-being versus external reliance. So this relates to the idea of projection and craving, like in a Buddhist sense, or intentionality. It's literally about energy. It's like we're not putting our energy into external images merely of what it is we truly need or what we truly are. We don't need to seek mere images of approval in order to feel secure in ourselves. We don't need to seek the image of success in order to know that we are successful, that we are success, that we create it. So it's literally an energetic thing. Like we are bringing it internally. And at first, there's going to be a projection. There is this empathy with the world, and there's still empathy involved in that, by the way. It's a reaching out with what I have and what I know and integrate within myself, rather than a codependent reaching out where there's this willful reluctance to actually integrate. I'd far rather lean on something or someone in the world, them to prop me up in a certain way, to meet a fixed image and help me avoid the shadow. So there's this key difference between empathy in a wholesome sense and codependency, an unwholesome form of projection. So it means embracing oneself fully versus perpetually pushing ourselves away, our true selves. It means choosing freedom versus slavery, because in order to not do that, to not embrace who we are, necessarily means slavery. As Jung said, if you don't know who you are, then the world will tell you. So it's a choice to make things conscious, which also means to gain freedom over them, to be in control of those facets of ourselves. It's about self-love versus self-hate. And what is self-hate other than a resistance to certain feeling? All form of hatred is resistant to feeling. So it means embracing that feeling, honoring it, giving it compassion, holding it, enduring the tension of opposites, and through that coming to accept and see it for what it really is, by the way, which means disidentifying from the image that we were scared of. That's the epitome of self-love. And of course, it means true love versus the master-slave dynamic. So a lot of this is about transcending what Hegel referred to as the master-slave dynamic, which is this way in which contradiction appears in our world. It's the idea of doing to others what we don't want done to ourselves. And so that's how the master-slave dynamic appears. We talked a lot about that in the last 2 courses. So I won't go into huge detail here, but it's basically where we're not honoring other people's freedom. We may be pretending to do so. We may be doing so by pretending that the aim that we're both working towards is what they need. It's the only thing they need. It's the ultimate or the absolute truth. But secretly, it's actually an exercise in power rather than an exercise in help, because it's not an honoring of the other person's freedom. And it's actually born from a misunderstanding of what freedom and selfhood really are. So midlife marks the choice of, do we embrace true love? So through this, we really come to understand what true love really is. And that means honoring other people's essence, understanding their essence, even though we cannot be conscious of it fully, but we can understand it, we can honor it. And that means respecting other people's freedom. And that any avoidance of that will just create contradiction. So it doesn't mean just taking off the handbrake or the guardrails completely. It doesn't mean that we accept unwholesome behavior, because remember, we're transcending the master-slave dynamic. In some ways, the way to honor freedom is to push back against violations of our own freedom. And where someone is abusing their freedom to violate freedom, which is the definition of evil, then the way to honor freedom is to negate that. So this is not about being passive. It's not about even being a pacifist. It's a synthesis of the benefits of these ideas. That brings us to the end of this episode. So thank you for your time and attention. If you enjoyed it, then please leave me a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. If you're listening to this on the podcast, I always appreciate ratings and reviews as well. For the Know Yourself program, simply head over to knowyourself.makeitconscious.com, and I'll see you soon.